This is the Art and Business of Writing podcast. John is an award-winning author whose writings have earned the Axiom Business Book Award, Gold Medal for The Go-Giver, the Nautilus Award for A Deadly Misunderstanding, and Taiwan's Gold Book Award for Innovation for You Call the Shots. And his 2012 Take the Lead with Betsy Myers was named Best Leadership Book of 2011 by Tom Peters and The Washington Post. His books are published in more than 24 languages and sold more than 2 million copies. John co-authored the international bestseller The Go-Giver with Bob Burg, the New York Times bestseller The Red Circle with Brandon Webb, and Flash Foresight with Daniel Burrus, USA Today bestseller The Slight Edge with Jeff Olson. He also ghostwrote the New York Times bestseller The Answer by John Arasaf and Murray Smith. His latest book, the national bestseller Among Heroes with former Navy SEAL Brandon Webb, was released on Memorial Day 2015. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much, Chris. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So how's it going there?
It's going great. It's crazy, busy, wonderful.
So take us beyond the bio. Tell us a little bit more about your life, your personal life, your creative life.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I'll say this. I did not start out in my adult life as an author of books. It wasn't what I did when I was in my 20s or 30s or 40s. It wasn't my plan. I've done so many different things, and careers just seem to sort of keep happening. So I started out, when I was a teenager, I started a high school with some friends, and I was in education, and then I went into nutrition and health, and I was in that field for maybe a decade, and I got into retailing and marketing, and I was in sales for a while, and that's where I bumped into Bob Burg originally. And then I've always written. My parents were both involved in writing and publishing, and so in the last couple decades of my life, writing has just taken center stage, and I find myself with, I guess, a couple dozen books to my name, and I'm having a blast doing it.
Now, when did you first realize that you were a writer, that you had a gift for writing?
I published an article when I was, I'm going to say 19 or 20, one of those, and so I was writing early on. I never had the thought I will be a writer, but I always knew that writing was something that I enjoyed. Actually, Chris, what I did a lot of for all those years was edit other people's stuff. I kept finding myself in positions where I was involved in some field where there was writing that was good content but a mess, and so I learned sort of the skill of cleaning up other people's writing and making it presentable, and I did that for decades. And so I kind of backed into writing primarily as an editor of other people's stuff, and I guess it occurred to me with The Go-Giver. Bob approached me and said, "Dude, I want to write this book, but I'm not the writer to do this book. You're the writer to do this book, so do it with me." And I had worked for Bob before. I had edited some stuff of his. And he said, "Listen, I don't want you to edit this. I want you to write this with me. Go in 50-50. We'll be a team." And so that's what we did. It was the first real book that I wrote.
Now, what were some of the fears and challenges you faced early on in your writing career?
Honestly, I would say the first challenge was, when Bob and I wrote The Go-Giver, we didn't have an agent. We didn't have any kind of direct channel to the New York publishing world. We didn't have a career in that sphere. I had worked on other people's books in the whole network marketing world, direct sales world, and other spheres, so neither of us had an in, and that was obviously a challenge. But the real challenges and the problems of writing that I faced early on are the same ones I face today. And it's the same with every book. It's facing a blank page, starting out with a project. To me, it's kind of like getting out of bed in the morning and saying, "Oh my God, I have a life to live." When you're an entrepreneur, and I'm going to say this about entrepreneurs at the moment, but it also really applies to everybody on the face of the planet, even if you're an employee working with the same company for 40 years. But if you're an entrepreneur, your life is going to happen because you make it happen. You are someone who makes things happen. There's no pre-carved, preset path or channel for you to just run in. So if it's going to happen, it's because you make it happen. that is a terrifying reality. It's also an exhilarating reality for entrepreneurs. For a writer, it's exactly the same. You know, it's like you are, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, it really doesn't matter. You're still making it up. Even if it's, most of the books I've done have been nonfiction, like other people's memoirs or a business book, like you mentioned, The Slight Edge, or books like that, but you're still making it up. You still have to create a story. You have to create something out of nothing. You have to build something that's going to have an impact on people's lives that doesn't exist. That's what an entrepreneur does in business. And honestly, that's what every human being alive does with their life, whether they're aware of it or not. So, you know, that's speaking in pretty big, spaced out terms. That's the biggest challenge for me of a writer. I mean, there are other more technical and more immediate challenges, and I'd love to talk about those. That's fun too. But I just thought I'd start with the big thing, which is, man, I got to make this up.
Right. But you said something really interesting to me, just the whole idea of framing a story. Like, how do you go about that? What's your process when you take on a book project or you decide you want to write something? How do you start to frame out the story?
Yes, that's a great question, and it is absolutely, for me, the most difficult and most painful part of the process. For me, writing can sometimes be a very uncomfortable process. There are also times when it's a totally thrilling, exhilarating process that I love. But the hardest part of it, and this is, I would say, true for every book. There might be exceptions, but I think it's been true for every book I've done. It's the hardest part is the part that nobody sees. It's the part before there's anything to look at on paper. It's figuring out, what is this book? I mean, what's the point? What's the story? What is this? What am I saying? What is this thing going to be? So, for example, you know, I might sit down with someone like Brandon Webb, former U.S. Navy SEAL, course master at the SEAL Sniper School. You know, extraordinary guy with an amazing past and amazing story. We sat down to write his life as a book, and it was still the same question. Okay, like, what's the story? Why would anybody read this? Yeah, he's a sniper. That's cool. He's a SEAL. That's awesome. But every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's going from somewhere to somewhere. It sets up a problem, and then you find a solution. I mean, in Hollywood, they say that screenplays happen in 3 acts. In Act 1, you get a guy up in a tree. In Act 2, you throw rocks at him. In Act 3, you get him out of the tree, you know, down on land again. That's the basic outline of a story, whether it's an Aesop fable or a 700-page novel. And figuring out, what is the arc of this story? What's the hook of the story? What story am I telling? That, it sounds simple, but it's the hardest part. I could spend months just trying to figure that out. And you ask, what's the process? It's like, take walks, take a drive, sit at my desk and act frustrated, have a cup of coffee, answer my mail, clip my nails, find some other way to procrastinate, tear my hair out, hit my head against the wall, ask myself, what am I doing? What am I saying? It's sort of like giving birth. And the biggest part of the process for me, this is as true now as it was in the beginning, but it's something I've only gradually learned to articulate, is to have faith that the story is in there. So when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm feeling incredibly frustrated and I don't know what's going on here, I say to myself, John, the story is in there. It's like, I love what Stephen King says about the process of writing. He says it's less like creating something for him and more like excavating a fossil. He said it's like the fully formed idea is already in there. My job is to extract it without damaging it. And that's what it feels like to me. There's a story in there that's patiently waiting for me to find it. So I have to not get too uptight and not get too anxious and just allow myself to sit here saying, what's the story?
Now, tell me a little bit about writing advice. Like, what are some of the things as a young writer as you were coming up that you had to learn and pick up and build into yourself as a writer, as a creative?
So as a creative, you take something like The Go-Giver. And this is true to an extent for every other book too, but I think it's less true for something like The Red Circle. I'm writing Brandon's memoir or some other person's memoir. They tell me their life story, and then I'm kind of editing that and shaping that. But something where you're more really kind of making it up, like The Go-Giver. Or there's a book called It's Not About You, which we're about to re-release as The Go-Giver Leader. And right now, I'm writing another parable, a parable about a boy and a master chef. These kind of stories where you're making something up, there's this tendency to overwrite. And amateurs have this, but so do professionals. I have it. And by overwrite, I mean make it too flowery. Make the description too purple, too elaborate. Say things far more strongly than they need to be said. Use too many words. Use too many exclamation points. Use a figure of speech that just makes you cringe when you go back the next day and read it. It's called overwriting. And overwriting is like an actor on the stage who acts like a total ham, who overacts. And, if you want to convey that you're sad, you can get a little bit of a sad look on your face, or you can thump your chest with your wrist and say, "Oh my God, I am so sad," and everybody will just puke. Right? It's just awful. That's what most writers do. I do it. So one of the greatest lessons I've had to learn, and I learned it in part from listening to interviews with other writers, but I learned it in part just from experience of going through it, is I have to give myself permission to write awful stuff. I give myself permission to write things that when I go back and read them, I'll cringe and say, "Oh my God, that's awful." But not say that, not go back and look at that. There's two phases to writing in broad terms: the creative phase and the refining phase. And the creative phase, you're trying to just pull this idea out of the ether and get it physicalized on the page. In the refining stage, you're taking what you've already written down and making it better. And they're totally different. They're completely different. The refining stage is where you put your editor's hat on. You put your critical hat on. You cannot create with your critical hat on. And that is the thing that kills most writers. Most people who say, "Oh man, I'd love to write. I tried, but I just couldn't do it." What happened to them was they had their critical hat on when they started creating. And that'll snuff the life out of it before you've gotten anywhere.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. How do you keep that critical side of you silent as you work?
You have to, it's the same thing, it's exactly the same thing that you do, no matter who you are or what your profession is, with negative thinking. When you catch yourself in negative thinking, say, "Oh man, I'm never going to be able to do this," or, why would they be interested in me? Or why would that girl go out with me? Or whatever your negative story is. When you have negative thinking, you have to simply train yourself and discipline yourself to take yourself by the hand and say, "John, we are now going to think a different thought." There's no magic to it. There's no mystery to it. It's a discipline. You have to say, you have to commit to recognizing, you have to look out for it. And when you see the negative thought, you have to say, "Aha, that is a negative thought. I will choose not to have it." It's the same thing as with writing. You have to know ahead of time that you are not going to allow yourself to have critical thinking. And when you write down this line of dialogue on the page, and when you start to feel rising up inside yourself, "That line sucks, it's awful," you have to say, "Oh, right, that's critical thinking. John, I'm going to take you by the hand and lead you over here to the corner of the room. Wait there. You can have critical thinking in its time, but that's not today. Right now, you have to just be quiet." And it is honestly, Chris, it's difficult. I still have. 2 hours ago, I was working on the draft of a chapter for this parable, and it was awful. And I had to say to myself, "John, you know it's awful. I know it's awful, but let's just pretend it's not, and just keep inventing, keep putting the words on the page." It's a discipline.
Ooh, that's very good. Keep putting the words on the page. I like
That's
that.
it.
I like
That's
that. You write such a diverse amount of copy. You write parables, write memoirs, write business titles. How do you switch your hats to do all those things?
That's a great question because it's something I have struggled with. There have been many times where I've had sort of two projects going at once, which I do not like. And in fact, I find that it doesn't work. I just really can't do it. I might have a project that I finished 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, and it kicks back to me because we're doing, copy editing or doing proofreading, and that's just mechanical. I don't have a problem with that. But actually being in the creating part of the cycle with two different projects, I found it just doesn't work. For me, what it's like, writing a book is very much like what it must be like to be a screen actor playing someone's life. Like, if I was, Bradley Cooper playing Chris Kyle, or if I were, whoever it was that played that amazing scientist in World War II, a British guy who decoded the German code. I forgot his name. Cumberbatch, An actor who plays a real character on the screen, from what I've heard, I've never done it, sort of inhabits that character. It's almost like they're channeling them, like a trance channeler or something. That's what it's like for me to write a book. I need to get inside the book. If I'm doing Brandon's book, I got to become Brandon. If I'm doing John Addison's book, I got to become John Addison. If I'm doing Rita Davenport's book, I got to be Rita Davenport. And I can't just jump out of that and jump in some other book like on the same day. I found I need at least 2 or 3 days, excuse me, in the same book. I can't switch gears that fast. That's for me. I don't know how it is for everybody.
Yeah. Now, with the parables, as far as the story goes, like, how do you develop those stories? Like with the Go Giver, you develop the entire story about, kind of the sales guy from beginning to end. How does that come about for the parable?
See, that's a great question, because I don't know how others work. I have this, I haven't read, here's True Confessions with Chris Jones. I have not read very many parables. It freaks people out when you hear that. Bob Burg has read like every business book ever written. He's the most well-read guy I know in this sphere. Not me. When I read, I mostly read fiction. I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I've read, probably the 8 or 10 great parables in business, like The Greatest Salesman in the World, or The 1 Minute Manager, and Richest Man in Babylon, and so forth. But there's an awful lot of parables out there that are, I get the sense that the author must have come up with the principles first that he wanted to teach, and then said, we got to get a story to fit this. To me, that doesn't work. So like with the Go Giver, we started with a premise, which was this guy, Joe, who had this problem. And we knew that the basic principle was about giving, the idea of giving value, of putting other people's interests first, focusing on that, and that the result of that was that you end up profiting very well yourself as well. I mean, we kind of knew the basic principle of the book, but in terms of the 5 laws of stratospheric success that the book hinges around, those didn't exist before we wrote the book. We didn't have those outlined. We didn't have those in mind. We let the story unfold, and the principles kind of came up organically as the story evolved. Now, I'm working on a book right now. Not every book that works that way, but I'm working on a book right now, as I said, about a young boy and a master chef, and there were 7 principles. And I spent about a month playing with the character, thinking about the situation, working with this master chef I'm writing with, and evolving these 7 principles. But once I started actually writing the story and following these characters through situations, I had to throw out some of the principles because they didn't work. They just weren't working. And some other principles that I hadn't counted on or planned on sort of arose up to take their place. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think if you want a book to be compelling and to feel real and authentic, if you want to touch people with it, I think the story and the truth of the characters has to be center stage. And you have to trust that your experience in life and what you've been exposed to is going to express itself as these principles that you want to have come out of it. You can't come up with some artificial sense of principles and then just enforce it on a story structure, because that's how it's going to feel. It's going to feel forced and artificial and lacking in real human depth.
Now, with memoirs, what's your process for interviewing? Because, of course, with a memoir, like you're talking about with Brandon Webb, you've got to spend time with Brandon, you've got to interview him, you got to get inside of his head, relive his experiences. How does that work?
Yeah, that's real simple. So for me, I do it the same way almost every time. I mean, and that is, many times the person will have some existing body of writing for me to start with. Like maybe they've drafted something, or maybe they've done a bunch of speeches and I can get transcripts. So often I'll start, like in Brandon's case, Brandon had actually drafted 2 chapters of a memoir. And I got to read those, and that was a great start. Actually, I take that back. he had drafted what chapter? His mom had also drafted a chapter, like describing his childhood, which was really cool. So, I look for some source material. I just finished a book. It's coming out actually, I don't know when this airs. It's coming out on November 3rd. So a memoir with Bob Burg, who's a political strategist and commentator on CNN. And his life was just unbelievable story of alcoholism and abuse in his childhood and struggles. And same with him. He had drafted chapters that I got to start with. Plus he had speeches. He had stuff on television that I could actually watch. So first I'll kind of go to school by following their speeches or material or whatever. And then, man, I get in the phone. I'll just have phone calls, usually 30, 40, 45 minutes for a call. And I'll just do call after call after call. The way I do it is I do a call where I ask them about one period of their life or one aspect of their life, and we'll have a conversation. I will then send that audio file off to my favorite transcriber, and she will transcribe it word for word and kick it back to me. And I'll start working with that as raw material. So I'll end up with this, I might have like 60, 70, 80, 100,000 words of raw material that I start kind of sifting through and playing with, and that's the clay that I'm gonna build the book out of.
Wow, that's a lot of copy. So
yeah.
So how do you decide where you want to begin with something like that?
I don't always know. When I start interviewing, I don't always know how, what again, the sort of the shape of the story is, what the arc of the story is. I usually find out pretty soon, but not always. Sometimes it takes a while to kind of figure it out. I just did a memoir with a guy who's a big CEO of a company that's coming out. His name is John Addison. He was the co-CEO of Primerica. It's coming out in 2016, and I struggled with that book for months, trying to figure out exactly, even though I knew the layout of his story, because he told me his whole life story, but trying to figure out what was kind of the point, like what's the title of chapter 1? What's the lesson? What is, everybody lives a life, and a billion things happen to you in life. But what story does that tell? That's kind of the human faculty of taking random events and pulling together a pattern out of it that tells a story that makes a point. You've seen Steve Jobs. Look at this. I mean, how many biographies are there of Steve Jobs out there now? Even a bunch of movies, and they're all different stories. Same guy, same life, but different stories. It's the storyteller's task to figure out what's the point I'm making here. Almost like, again, I go back to Aesop's fables. Fox and grapes. Androcles, the lion and the thorn. Where are we getting to with this story? So that's, you asked how do you decide, how do you know where to start? It's kind of sifting through and just looking for what grabs me, what makes, to me, the compelling point about this person's life.
Ooh, awesome. Thanks so much. Now let's talk about what you're working on right now.
Yeah, well, I mentioned Bob Burg. Just finished that book, actually. That's done and behind me. I'm working on another book with Brandon. We actually have 2 books in the works, but I'm working on a book with Brandon about a handful of different U.S. military snipers, which is a sort of complex, multi-piece memoir of a sniper. Only it's like 4 different snipers. So that's a huge challenge. Right at this moment, I'm working on another parable. I'm hoping this will be out in 2016, but we don't have a publication date set yet. And it's the story of a young boy who's in trouble in his life, whose dad has died, and he goes to work for someone who turns out to be a master chef. There's always a wise mentor figure in one of these parables. And I've been struggling a lot for the last month, and it finally feels like I'm on track with that little sucker. It's the task here, the challenge here, is to walk the line between a story that is a parable that makes a point, that's didactic, that's teaching. It's not meant to be a novel. It's not true to life. It doesn't have all the vivid, gory details like a 300-page novel would. So it's a kind of a 2-dimensional teaching story. At the same time, you want it to be real. You want to let these characters come to life. In fact, today was really the first day that sitting there tapping words on my computer that I started to feel like these characters were coming to life and telling me what they would do next, rather than me imposing on them what they do next.
That's always been very interesting to me, John, is just how people breathe life into a fictional character.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of weird. You know what it's like? I have 5 kids, and it's a lot like seeing your kid suddenly say something that you never thought of. Like, I did not teach him that. Where did he come up with that? And, your kid is suddenly he's 6, and then he's 10, and then he's 23. And it's like this is a whole person, a whole universe there. Came from me, and at first knew nothing but, it's like, didn't know any words but what we taught him. It's like that with characters in your story, in your fiction, in your parable, in your whatever. You create the character and you create the situation, but after a while, it does start to take on a life of its own. It's not, weird or woo-woo. It's just what happens. Any writer who deals with characters and fictional situations will tell you that there comes a point where the character starts to suggest what they're going to do next, as opposed to what you want them or plan for them to do next. And they may not be the same thing. I remember writing a screenplay once where suddenly a character that I loved, I realized this character was going to die. And I was like, man, crying. I was like so upset. But it's just what the story was going to do.
Wow. Yeah, it's true. I hear a lot of fiction writers say that. The character just takes a life of its own and does what it wants to do. And there's really, I'm just there to be a vessel to the character, as opposed to the other way around,
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Now earlier on, we talked about kind of the beginnings and how, when you met Bob, you said you guys did not have an agent. Like, what was the process of getting an agent to take on your book?
Something that is probably not replicatable by any listener here, because it was wild. I am a big believer, as is Bob, in creative visualization and in imagining and seeing the future you want to create, and in the power of that. Martin Luther King never said, "I have a plan." He said, "I have a dream." It's like when a vision is compelling. A plan is what follows later. So we had no plan for finding an agent. We didn't know one. And through a circuitous series of events, which I won't go into at length because we don't have time, but the short story is I happened to have a friend who contacted me out of the blue after 20 years we hadn't talked. He needed me to help him with a project. I agreed to, and I named a price. He couldn't pay me. He had no money whatsoever. So for some reason, I agreed to do it for nothing, but split the eventual profits, which there never were any because the project never happened. But in the meanwhile, it turned out he had an agent, and he promised he'd introduce me to the agent, and he tried to introduce me to the agent, but they weren't really interested in getting a new client. But then finally they did, and it happened that they were the agent who had sold the 1-Minute Manager to a publisher in New York in 1980, which became probably the best-selling business parable of all time and made their career. And that was the agent that my friend I hadn't heard from for 20 years just happened to bump into me, turn me on to, who saw the manuscript of the Go-Giver and loved it and became my agent, and we've worked together ever since. So, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's kind of out of the blue. A more practical, concrete answer is it really is about networking. It's about if you want to get an agent to represent your stuff, which I highly recommend. If you want to publish in the traditional publishing world, a good agent is, in my experience, is essential. If you're going to go some unconventional route or self-publish or promote works through blogs, etc., and the internet, there's a whole new creative avenue there. You may not need an agent for that at all. But in the traditional publishing route, agent essential. The best way to find one is, in broad terms, is to network, is to communicate with other authors who write in the same kind of genre you do, who write the kind of books you want to write, who have been successful. Connect with them, get their advice. I've introduced a handful of people that I know to my agent or to other agents just because their stuff was really good, and that's in some cases worked out really well. So It's like anything in life, man. It's like if you don't have the resource, you network with people who do until it rubs off on you.
Now, how persistent do I need to be in order to do that? You have writers sometimes almost by nature can be a little bit withdrawn, a little introverted. They love their craft but have a hard time going beyond that.
Yes, that's really great because it's true. I think that a writer, writers cannot exist in a vacuum. And so I am a fairly introverted person. I don't love being on the stage. I don't love being out in public. I don't love big parties. But no writer can be successful in a vacuum. A writer is also, by definition, an entrepreneur. And so connecting with people, working with people, my screenwriting teacher, who I adore, he's an amazing man, Hal Crosman. He's a screenwriting teacher in Hollywood, and he's brilliant. And he boiled all the studies we did down to two principles, and they were, if you want to be successful in Hollywood, which is not something I've yet done because I haven't focused there, but it's something I was doing for a while. He says you got to do two things. Number one, your writing has to be extraordinary. You can't be good. It can't even be great. It has to be outstanding. It has to be mind-blowing. You have to just perfect your craft, work on it every day, write every day, take good feedback and good critique from people you trust and improve it. That's a given. The other thing you need to do is to be someone who is okay to work with. You can't be a jerk. You can't be a prima donna. You can't be an iconoclast. You can't be temperamental. You can't be precious about your own stuff. You have to be someone who is willing to take critique, willing to work with people, who is a pleasure to work with. And I find that so true. This archetype of the temperamental artist who's just a genius, it's like nobody wants to work with that guy. You have to some extent, sell yourself. And by sell yourself, I just mean believe passionately in what you're doing and what you're able to do, and have those conversations with people. It's really essential. I don't mean you have to become, an expert salesperson and study sales and become a marketing whiz to market your stuff. But you do need to be able to interact with the world.
Right. Well, I like what you said just about being, just being extraordinary and refining. I think that's such an important thing to do.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier the thing about how you have to turn that critic off.
Yeah.
So then there's the other side, which is when you turn the critic on. And it's interesting. I've been thinking about this lately. I'm tempted to someday publish, or at least make available online, a few pages of the original Go Giver manuscript before our agent ripped it apart. Because you asked about persistence. The Go Giver was turned down 22 times by publishers. And you hear these stories, about Kentucky Fried Chicken or Chicken Soup for the Soul, or these famous archetypal stories of guys who persisted through multiple rejections. Man, that was us. 22 rejections from publishers on the Go Giver before Adrian Zackheim at Portfolio Penguin said yes. And here we are, 500,000 copies later in 20 languages around the world. It was a good decision, but we got rejected so much. And the truth was, the original manuscript had a lot of flaws. We spent probably 9 months rewriting that puppy. I think that the ability to take criticism, take critiquing, and also to get people who have the skill to give good feedback, because not everybody does, it's essential. Stephen King, I'll go back to him, says you write your first draft with the door open and your first draft with the door closed, second draft with the door open. Door closed means you don't show what you're doing to anybody, not even your wife. I mean, you don't show what you're doing. You don't even show it to yourself. You just write it, get it on paper. Second draft is with the door open. This is where you take it to your wife, to your husband, to your best friend, to your agent, to your editor, to your circle, close circle of acquaintances who really know writing, and say, so what do you think? And then you listen. And even if you don't agree, you listen, because they probably have a point. They may not be totally accurate. And then when they say you got to change this, that may not be the truth, but it might be. I mean, I've taken some hard criticism. Twice in the last year, I had a book that I thought was done and perfect, and it's been ripped to shreds by somebody who was involved in the project. And when I got out the other end, I realized they were right. it wasn't ready.
Wow. Now, how do you fight the discouragement, though? Because, so critique, it can get to you. How do you stand up to the discouragement and just kind of stay the course and persevere through it?
Well, I think there's a few things there. First of all, I think you really, and this is really important, you really have to be judicious in who you show stuff to and who you ask for critiques from. That's really, really important because, it's almost like don't trust anyone to operate on your leg. You want a surgeon who knows what he's doing. So that's important. You can't just open the doors to the world. And also, I think it's important, that you can tell people, listen, I want your critique. Please be honest, but also remember, I'm a person here, so don't be too caustic. But let me know just honestly. And it's also good to develop questions. But how do you deal with the discouragement then? Because I think that comes down to faith. And I bumped up against this wall many times, and I still do. As I said, I've done like 24 books, some of them very successful. And I still, with every book, reach a point where I say, this isn't working, this is no good, this is bomb, this is just not happening. Or it feels to me like I've lost it. The book is crappy. And I have to, that's even before I get anybody's critique. It's even worse when somebody else comes back and confirms that and says, yeah, this is no good, this stinks. I find I have to develop the faith that it's in there. The story is in there. The story is a shining, golden, powerful story. I know it's there. The process is just finding it. And I may have to whittle away a lot of verbiage to get to it. I may have some incorrect thoughts about how to present it that I have to change or discard. But it's the faith that it's good. There's an outcome. There's a positive outcome. You know how they say, it ain't, what do they say? It'll all come out in the end?
Yes.
What's that expression? It'll all be okay in the end. If it's not okay, then it's not the end. Yeah, it's like that.
Yeah, I like
it's
that.
It's like that. Yeah, it's exactly how it is. There's an excellent book here. I know there's an excellent book here. If this isn't excellent, what's in my hand, then I'm not done yet. But that's okay because I'm going to be done. I'm going to get there. This book is in there. I'm going to find it. I think that's the faith you have to have. You have to just know it's true.
Now, what kept you and Bob going back time and again after, from one rejection to 2 to 20 to 22?
First of all, we totally believed in the story. We had that faith that I just described. We knew we just knew this story had value. It would make a difference. We had total faith in the value of the story. We also had an agent, Margaret McBride, and her team, who totally believed in the book, totally believed in the story. So, and we had more in our team, my wife and other people. But, so we had a team who totally believed in it. We totally believed in it. We knew it was a matter of time. We just believed that was so.
Now, with an agent, we talked about it a little, here and there. What's the best method to go about selecting an agent as a writer? If you had a situation where you had 3, 4, 5 different agents who were all interested in you and you had to select, that would be a very cool thing. That's a rare thing. But going with an agent is a lot like going with a publisher or an editor. When you go, let me answer this question first, Chris. Can I deflect the question and say, sure.
Let's say I got a book, you've got a manuscript, and you shopped it out. You or your agent have shopped it out, and you've got 3, 4, 5 different publishers who have some level of interest. How do you pick one? It's not necessarily the one who's offering the biggest dollar figure for an advance. Advances these days can be anywhere from a lot to nothing, and mostly they're very little. Advances have shrunk since the 2009 crash. But whatever the case, you have someone who's offering 3 times what this other one is offering. That is, to me, not an issue. It is an issue because if a publisher is offering to buy a book for a lot of money, that shows they have a lot of investment in it, and they're going to get behind it, and they're going to market it, and they're going to promote it, and that's good. But what I care more about is who's the editor, who is the individual that we're going to have a relationship with. Every book I've done, we've had a relationship with a specific editor at that publishing company. And that relationship is crucial. It's the same thing with an agent. When you're working with an agent, that's a relationship. I've had agents, Margaret's not the only agent I've worked with. I've worked with a few other agents for different projects. I've worked with agents who, once the book was sold, I never heard from them again. That's not what I want. I worked with another agent who was not that way, who was very, very aggressive and stayed in touch. But Margaret, I can't say enough good things about. She's been someone who, once a book is finished, she's like with it every step of the way. She's totally invested, totally involved. A wonderful person, a good friend. So you really it's kind of a question of chemistry. You want to find, ideally, an agent that is a person that you like, that you enjoy talking with, that you connect with, that you feel like they're not just going to try to sell your book. They're there to build your career, to build you. They believe in you. So that's what you're really looking for, ideally.
Now, to break in and to start to develop a body of work, to start to get noticed, do you recommend any sort of, I don't want to call it a path, but just kind of any recommended steps for a writer who's saying, okay, I've got a book, I really want to do something with this. How do I take it from my laptop all the way to a publishing house?
Right. There are lots of people who will have good answers to that question who aren't me. And there are a lot of good answers that I don't know, that I've heard other people give. This resource, this networking group, that kind of group, and so forth. I don't know a lot of those things. So I can't offer a lot of that. Here's what I can offer. I think that creating a presence for yourself and this topic, the topic of your book. Let's say you've written a book about snowshoeing because you're passionate about getting out in the snow and seeing nature and doing it on snowshoes, and you happen to know who invented snowshoes and who were the forefathers of snowshoeing in America, and whatever. You have this whole thing about snowshoeing. I totally believe that whether you're going to publish through Simon & Schuster or Penguin or Random House in New York, or you're going to self-publish or go with a smaller publisher or whatever, no matter what model you're going to use, you want to create a presence for yourself and that topic and that passion online. Create a blog about it. Create either a Facebook page about it or a website around it, whatever is the most current sort of social media coin. Personally, I think creating a blog around that topic and that passion especially, and I make that distinction. People don't care about topics, they care about passions. So nobody says, I wonder if I can find a site on snowshoeing. But they might say, did you hear about this guy who's like bonkers about snowshoeing? And when he writes about it, you feel like he's writing about the lost love of his life. People plug into passions. So get your passion online. And you can also use the blog as an opportunity to test out little bits of material and to refine your writing style and to improve things. And maybe you'll even end up re-editing your book based on experiences you had writing the blog. What you're also doing when you do that is, aside from exposing your passion and refining your writing, is you're developing a following. And the first question any agent is going to ask, if you go and try to break into an agency or try to sell to a publisher, they're all going to ask the same first question, which is, what's your platform? And what they mean by platform is, what exposure do you have? What segment of the public is already wanting to know about your book, even though it isn't out yet? If you are somebody who appears regularly on television, on network television, well, that's a heck of a platform. That's great. If you're someone who has a speaking career and you give 100 speeches a year to huge groups, that's awesome. That's a great platform. Most of us aren't either of those people. But if you can create a compelling platform through social media, if you can create a Twitter following, a blog following, a Facebook following that's demonstrable in numbers that you can show to a publisher, 6-7 years ago, the publishers didn't get that, but they get it now. That has monetary value to them. What a publisher wants to know, and it sounds crass, but this is, they're going to risk money to publish your book. What they want to know is, can we guarantee that 6,000 people are going to buy this book the day it publishes? Can we guarantee that even without doing any marketing on our own, just because of you and your passion and who you are and what you've done with it, that 10,000 copies are going to sell in the first 3 months, or 4,000, or don't take those numbers as absolute, but that there's going to be a basic groundswell of demand for your book just because of you and your book and your passion, then we can build on that. So you can create that for free online. And I think that's a really important thing for any aspiring author to do.
All right, we're going to start to wrap up a little bit. Wanted to ask you a couple of just kind of brain-picking questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Tell me a couple of authors or writers that you really admire.
Again, I read a lot of fiction. My favorite author is Kate Atkinson, who's a British writer. My favorite novel of all time is called Behind the Scenes at the Museum. It's her first novel. I blogged about it on my birthday. I had an experience this year. I woke up on my birthday thinking about Kate Atkinson and her new book. And I went to New York City that day with my wife for some meetings I had at a publisher. I went to the publisher, I got out of my meeting, and I walked into a room, and Kate Atkinson was sitting there signing books. So, you do create your own reality. I love I love John Irving. I love mysteries. I love Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. I love the old stuff. I'm right now reading Robert Crais, Crais, who's phenomenal. Of course, I love the Lee Child books. They're magnificent. I read a lot of, quote, serious books. I read a lot of detective fiction. I love Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors. Neil Gaiman could rewrite the phone book, and I would pay real money to buy it and read it. He's such a wonderful, compassionate, delightful, poetic soul. I love everything he does. A couple short answers there.
Tell me, what's your go-to book on writing, business, or professional development?
Wow. Okay, that's just... So I've mentioned Stephen King twice tonight. His book on writing is just definitive. It's marvelous. It's wonderful. And it's very, very tangible and practical. Anybody who's interested in writing definitely is going to want to read that book, On Writing by Stephen King. Business, personal development, business. I love everything Seth Godin has done. He's one of my go-to writers for business. There's so many great business writers, and I'm not an expert in that. I don't read a lot in that sphere, but I do love Seth Godin's stuff. And personal development, gosh, I need an answer for that. I fell in love as a kid with the Narnia books. I later fell in love with Buckminster Fuller. And I would say that C.S. Lewis and Buckminster Fuller have probably been the two most influential writers and thinkers in my life ever. I didn't even know what personal development was at that time, but later when I bumped into it, it all seemed like echoes of C.S. Lewis and Bucky Fuller to me. I still love them both. So there you go.
All right. How do you decompress?
I gradually over the decades, I have become, although in some ways a more focused person, also in some ways a more relaxed person. And it's been, partly because I married up. I got married 8 years ago to 8 years, 7 years, I have to count. So anyway, I'm 60, and it took me until my 50s to figure out who I was in love with. And it was a great thing. Just love my life. You got to have a life of personal happiness to be able to decompress from the drive of what you do. Because being a writer involves a lot of being very self-driven. To relax, I love to read. I take walks. I sleep. I cook.
I'm sure that last part's very appreciated, huh?
It is. I love to cook. We cook together. We love cooking together. By the way, one quick point.
Yeah.
I often with writing, I reach a point where even in the middle of a book and I get a deadline and I can't write. I'm stuck. It's gone. It's not writer's block. It's I'm empty. I have to take 2 days off and go read a novel. You have to read. If you want to write, you have to read a lot. The more you read, the better, and especially good writing. Don't read garbage. And by garbage, I mean writing. It's entertaining, but it's just not that good. My favorite example is Brad Thor. I think Brad Thor is abominable. The only book I've read in the last couple of years that I physically felt like throwing across the room. I just hated the stuff. But it sells like hotcakes. I don't care if it sells. It's awful. So you want to get books that are really well crafted, that are powerfully well written, and feed yourself those books. You cannot breathe out unless you breathe in. You cannot write unless you read.
You beat me to my last question. I was going to ask you what kind of parting advice you'd like to leave. It sounds like you got to, but if you got something else you want to leave behind, the floor is yours.
Man, I guess what I'm going to say is don't ever fall prey to this idea, this has already been done, so I can't do it. Not true. Everything that you could do has not yet been done. I don't care what it is. The world is absolutely unlimited in possibilities. So sometimes people squelch their creativity or their drive with this thought, oh man, I have this idea for a book, but they've already written that. Or I have this idea for a business, they've already done that. Not true. You are unique. There's never been another one, never will be. Anything that you want to do, if you can find the right form or outlet for it, one shape, form or another, it's yours to do.
Last question, how can our listeners connect with you?
Best is through my website, johndavidmann.com. There's the standard contact me, thing there. You can write to me, and I actually do write back. I'm not much of a Facebook, Twitter guy, but mainly I connect through email and especially through my website, johndavidmann.com.
John David Mann, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, glad we got this together.
Yeah, and best of luck on all your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, and likewise.
Wow, what an inspiring episode. If you weren't able to take notes, I've got you covered. Visit my website at www.chrisjonesinc.com/podcast to get today's show notes, as well as access other episodes you may have missed. Be sure to subscribe and rate the podcast on iTunes. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time.